Awesome. So yeah, lovely. Thank you everyone for coming and yeah, welcome to another rapid response training. So this one's sort of on, what happens after the story is published and responded to. And I know a few of you may be thinking, that's a bit of an odd title, but essentially it's about how we can make the most of a story and really understand the different pathways and outcomes after a story is published. So yeah, for that reason, this presentation's a little bit longer, and so there, are a few things that we can get into. So let's begin. Brilliant. Um, so yeah, today we're going to really be looking into areas such as, exploring, meaningful follow-up when contact's established, identifying, when further contact isn't possible, and what we can learn from that, and considering how stories can drive service improvement. And of course, we will discuss practical follow-up and examples. But to start off, I want to ask you, when do you think a care opinion story ends? And we can discuss this after the presentation. But have a think of it now. Is it, once we've responded to the story, is it when we've contacted the patient, or is it when we've resolved the complaint? So from today, I want to argue that actually a story doesn't necessarily end with a resolution. It can, but it also ends when we've made the most of the opportunity it presents. So what this does is it sort of shifts our organizational focus from resolving stories to instead also learning from them. So stories no longer become transactional. They are instead this living, constantly being revisited, memories and even lessons. Um, so there are three pathways we can imagine for once a story is published. And again, this is broadly speaking, but we've got pathway one, which is if the author never contacts us, which can happen. Pathway two, which is, the author does contact us. And pathway three, which is, the author's contacted us and the issue is resolved. And each of these offer us different ways of dealing with stories. So I'm going to start with pathway two because it's a little bit easier. I might actually pop back a slide so you can have a look, but it's a little bit easier to talk into how we can, make really meaningful improvement because it's a lot easier to sort of investigate and look into those issues. So yeah, with pathway two, I know it does seem a little bit backwards, but it is that conversation. And so it's really about what happens once the author contacts you. So sometimes an author reads a response, reads the contact details, and of course decides to get in touch. So it might be via email, over the phone. And as we know, it's a really valuable opportunity, but it's important as well to remember that the goal isn't simply to close the complaint or resolve the issue. So once the author reaches out, what happens next? What do we do after that? So you can talk about it on Care Opinion. So I've got a response here where they talk into the story and of course they invite the author for contact. And so at this point, anyone sort of reading this story can see that the service has really listened and is willing to continue the conversation. But then this is the bit I think that sometimes can be overlooked, not all the times as we can see here. But it's a follow-up response and the author did make contact with the service, and so rather than leaving that conversation behind closed doors, the responder actually came back to Care Opinion, and as you can see they've posted that follow-up response. So I also think notice they haven't disclosed any confidential information or even shared the outcome. Instead, they've explained, they've said here they appreciate the opportunity to speak with the author, outline some of the improvements, and really reassured readers about the work being done. So this is what we mean by closing the loop in pathway 2. The follow-up isn't really for the original author. They know what happened. The authors contacted them offline, so they know what's occurred. But it's for everyone else reading the story. So future patients and community members can now see that the service didn't just respond, but they've actually listened and engaged and continued that conversation. So, yeah, always good. In a response, if an author has reached out, you can just post a follow-up response similar to this one, thanking them for the conversation. You don't have to give too much away, but anyone else reading that story, it makes such a difference to them. Yeah. So, so pathway 3 is, once we've spoken with the author, perhaps we've, answered their questions, explained what happened, listened to their concerns. And so this is where we move on to that third pathway. Because, we do need to answer the question, now what? Is this where the story ends? They've reached out to us. Has that conversation, finished our interaction with this story? And so we do have an opportunity to ask ourselves other questions. So we can ask ourselves, what have we learnt from this? Did it highlight a process that needs reviewing? Did staff identify an opportunity for improvement, or has anything changed? And if it has, have we told anybody? And that's the main thing. Because we do need to remember that care opinion, it's not just a conversation between you and one person, but it's definitely that public conversation, which we've spoken about a lot before. But yeah, really coming back to that story and sharing what happened afterwards definitely closes that loop. So I'll show you an example, and you'll see what I mean and how it's a bit different to the example I just showed you. Brilliant. So we had a story for South Metropolitan Health Service, and I won't go into the story, but this is the first response, and the service begins by, of course, acknowledging the experience and inviting them to contact the patient and family liaison service. And so at this point, we've really only seen pathway 2 begin. The service has opened the door for further conversation, but we don't know if the author ever responded. So, it's in that pathway 1 or pathway 2. But, the service posts a follow-up response, which shows that, it's gone down that pathway 2. The author has indeed reached out, and, they've contacted the service, and investigations taken place, and the service returns to care opinion with a follow-up response. But I want you to have a look at what they've done here. Rather than simply saying, the matter has been resolved, they've explained what they found, and they did provide some context around the patient's care, and they acknowledged the impact that the situation had on the author, and you can see how they've outlined the next steps. So again, they're not revealing confidential information that wasn't already part of the conversation, and you'd have to read the story. But instead, they're really demonstrating to everyone reading the story that they listened and took the concern seriously. But it has not ended there. And this is why it's down that pathway 3 as opposed to pathway 2. But yeah, the authors then, posted another update explaining, that they're unable to continue to see their private cardiologist. And, the service again doesn't leave that conversation hanging, but they post another update because the author, reached out to the service offline as well. So they were able to actually resolve this issue, and the resolution was clear on care opinion. So yeah, I'll pop to the next slide. Because we've got a wonderful, this is the last response from the author, and they've actually thanked the service for the assistance. So the reason I want to highlight this story is because it is powerful evidence that public, transparent conversation has taken place all the way through to completion. We can actually see that journey. They can see the service respond, they can see the author engage, and we can see the issue evolve and the service continue to communicate throughout. So that's what closing the loop really looks like. It's not about just posting one response and hoping for the best, but it's about continuing that public conversation where appropriate, so that everyone, not just the author, can see that feedback has been really heard and really acted upon and followed through. So yeah, to get to a full, pathway 3, as you will, it's just a way of sort of describing these sort of stories and responses where we can see this journey. It's not the most common that we see, but when we do see it, it absolutely has, I would say, probably the most impact, because it's quite, it's quite powerful when you see, healthcare in conversation, and it makes such a difference. Brilliant. Now, I'll return to pathway 1, which is where, the author doesn't contact us and they never reach out. And so this is arguably one of the more challenging pathways for services to navigate. It's something we hear a lot. The story's been published, you've written a response inviting the author to get in touch, but then you never hear from them again. So for many services, this can absolutely feel like the end of the road. We might think, well, without more information, there's nothing else we can do. But today I want to encourage you to think about this a little differently. Rather than asking how do we investigate this, perhaps we should instead ask, what can we learn from this? So sometimes the story itself provides enough information to identify opportunities for improvement. It could highlight an environmental issue. I think I've got this on the next slide. And for this reason, I've put a little dotted line. You can see, that environmental process. We did speak about this in the anonymity webinar last week about how sometimes you don't need to know the identity of an author to make a change. And this happens a lot in those environmental / process stories, where you can see it's going to affect lots of patients, not just this one. So yeah, sometimes, this is an action, we can take, and it's usually when the story discusses, these two issues. Sometimes the story can still lead to improvement without the author ever contacting the service, as we've just said. So it's not the traditional pathway, but it reminds us that author contact isn't always necessary for a story to have an impact. But I'm more interested in how we get impact when the author doesn't reach out, which we're going to get to, but I did include an example of this. So in this example, the author mentioned that while their experience was very positive, the emergency department trolleys were uncomfortable. And as you can see here, it's resulted in a change. So, they don't need to identify the author to make this change with the ED trolley. So it's just showing you that, even without knowing the identity, we can make changes. Brilliant. But the one that I'm interested in is what happens when the author doesn't contact us and it's a story that, they probably do need to contact us and reach out. So for these sort of stories, I always ask, how does this story make me feel? Is this a story that, I'm going to remember for whatever reason? Will it stay with me? Good way, bad way? Does it change the way I might think about a certain illness or healthcare experience? Or even, can I imagine more of what it must be like to be in their shoes? So even if no further contact occurs, the story may still prompt discussion, within the team. You can reflect on current practices or even change the and improve care for future patients. So while the conversation with the author may end here, the learning certainly doesn't have to. So what I want to leave you with is this, and this is what I want the main takeaway to be from today, is while we've talked about these three pathways, I don't want you to think of pathway one as a dead end or an unsuccessful outcome. I don't want you to see the issue being resolved as the only meaningful impact that a story can have. Sometimes stories can have really meaningful impact that it's not tangible. So, of course, it is wonderful when an author chooses to engage with the service and the story progresses all the way to pathway three. But I want you to walk away from today thinking that's not the only measure of success. And I want you to think, how does this story make me feel? And has it changed anything within me? So, and that is how all stories, all pathways have that potential to lead to change and impact. So, stories absolutely change us. They impact us in ways that data often struggles to. So, let yourself be changed by these stories. Really let yourself be impacted. What can they teach you? What new experiences will you realize by being in someone else's shoes? So, I've just also graduated from uni, and I have my honors in philosophy. And when I was writing this webinar, it really reminded me of a theory that we studied called affect theory. And I'm not going to drone on, but it is something that I think is relevant and quite interesting. So it's a theory that emerged much earlier, but it definitely had a bit of a boom, around the 1980s and 1990s. And the humanities, it basically shifted from this focus on identity and subjectivity, finding a place for the self, to focusing more on relationships and how these affected us. So, these relationships are often understood through the concept of affect. That's why it's called affect theory. So, and the quote here is from one thinker that I think is particularly relevant to what we're talking about, and that's Karen I think it's Barad, who she distinguishes between this interaction and intra-action. And so what she's saying is that instead of assuming separate individuals come together and interact, she actually argues that beings emerge through their relationships. So from this perspective, being affected by something isn't simply something that we have, but it actually emerges who we are through our relationships and shapes who we've become. So now, the reason I think this is relevant is because the more we read patient stories and interact with other experiences, the more these can shape us and affect our being. And this impact, it definitely can't be understated. So I think this is really quite a central point to Care Opinion, is that practice of letting yourself be moved by these stories, letting yourself be changed, affected. Maybe it will change how you see the world and interact with it. Yeah, so sorry to go all philosophy, but I think it's a wonderful concept of how these stories are living and changing. And it's something that data doesn't necessarily always do very well, but stories are quite unique at it. So finally, I'm going to finish off and just say you can actually also say this in your response. So if nothing else, you can write in your response how their story impacted you, how you weren't aware of this side of the story. You personally have been impacted. So not all stories necessarily need to result in a process change. Sometimes it really is enough to just know that your experience has had an effect and you've been heard. And maybe that someone has, been witness to your experience and you've had an impact on them. So yeah, let yourself be in their shoes, really let yourself be impacted by these stories and write about that in your responses.